in music and in the world of sport. And as for our usual bird song to end the programme, it has of course to be that extraordinary goose flying high as an aeroplane over the Himalayas.
Hello, welcome to More or Less on the BBC World Service. I'm Wesley Stevenson. There's been shock and outrage about reports that 43 students in Mexico have gone missing and are presumed to have been murdered. And it was a statistic in a story about the students' disappearance that's led one of our listeners, Trent Houghton, to contact us. An article on the Huffington Post website said that roughly 98% of murders in Mexico were unsolved. At first glance, that might seem like an incredibly high number. Can it be true? Our reporter Keith Moore has been investigating. So Keith, what have you found out?
The first thing to mention is Mexico's murder rate of 21.5 murders per 100,000 people. That's much higher than the US at 4.7 per 100,000, and also every country in Europe. However, it is still behind 20 other countries and way behind Honduras, which has a murder rate of 90 per 100,000. I spoke to Carlos Villalta, who is a visiting fellow at the Center for US-Mexican Studies in the University of California in San Diego, and he told me that when a murder suspect had been arrested and was in court, the chance they would actually go to jail was very high.
From 1997 to 2011, we have about a 90% conviction rate. So if you get arrested for a homicide crime, there's a chance of 9 in 10 to actually be convicted. The problem here is how many of them get arrested.
Okay, so the chances of conviction are high if a murder suspect is actually arrested, charged, and then put in front of a court. But what about the question of whether 98% of murders in Mexico are unsolved?
Well, according to statistics released by Mexico's National Institute of Statistics, that is in fact correct. They formulate the rate by combining two sets of figures: judicial statistics for the number of people who have been convicted of murder, and health statistics for the number of people that have died a violent death, which have then been confirmed by a doctor as homicide.
It is really rare to find a murderer being arrested in the end, and being in jail for a homicide crime is just 2% chance, which is statistically significant. What you have is basically a statistical anomaly. When you look at historically at the trend, would you see that these variations, around 98%, are pretty much a constant historical pattern of state failure.
Carlos Villalta said he doesn't think Mexico's rate for unsolved murders would be very different from other countries in Central and South America. However, there's little data to back this up.
It's astonishingly low, isn't it? I mean, the one question I imagine everyone is asking now is why are so few homicides in Mexico solved?
Well, that was the question I asked Stephen Dudley, the co-director of Insight Crime, which is an investigative think tank based in the US and Colombia.
The number one factor is that the institutions there, specifically these judicial institutions, simply don't work. They have this incredible way of either bungling up investigations, not actually doing investigations, being influenced by those who are being investigated, either threatened or co-opted in some way, or perhaps even paid off in some way. So there's an incredibly high inefficiency. But of course, that then bleeds into other types of reasons that would be obvious offshoots from this, which is that people don't trust these institutions. People will not go to the authorities with the crime at all.
Stephen Dudley said there were failures in several different layers of the judicial system that led to the low rate of prosecution for homicides, and both he and Carlos Villalta were critical of the police. Stephen Dudley did also, interestingly, speak to me about the role of forensic scientists when it comes to crime scenes.
They're often too afraid to do their work. They do their work too quickly. They do their work sloppily. Just a complete lack of understanding of how to develop a crime scene. I've been to crime scenes where you've got little kids playing, with a stick in blood of a victim. Things like that. That just shows you that already you are going to have problems.
That was Stephen Dudley, and thanks to Keith Moore. And if you want to hear more about the troubles in Mexico, make sure you tune in to the new World Service programme, The Inquiry, next Tuesday, when they'll be asking who runs Mexico. Just a quick reminder, you're listening to More or Less on the BBC World Service with me, Wesley Stevenson. Now, last week you may have noticed that Wayne Rooney became the 9th English footballer to win 100 caps when captaining the side to a 3-1 victory against Slovenia. Rooney has received plenty of plaudits for his achievement, but one former player, Chris Waddle, he's argued that caps are easier to win today than in previous eras, and given that we like to talk a little bit about football on this programme, Ben Carter and I decided that our work this week should involve looking at the numbers. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Wes. One of the striking things when looking at some of the great players from previous generations was actually how few games they played for their national team. I mean, if you take Dutch legend Johan Cruyff's international career, which lasted 12 years, which is the same length as Rooney's career to date, he only played 48 times for his country. And then there's the Portuguese forward Eusebio, who played for 13 years, but again, he just got 64 caps.
Yeah, that surprised me, because the two best players of the current generation, so Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi, they've already won a lot more caps than that, and they're still relatively young.
That's right. Ronaldo's 29, and he's got 117 caps, and Lionel Messi is 27, and he's got 96, so he's nearly at 100 already. And one of the reasons that players like Cruyff and Eusebio, and even Maradona and Pelé didn't win 100 caps was because fewer games were played in years gone by. If you use England as an example, in the 60s, they played about 10 games per year. But in the modern era, it's more like 12, or to be absolutely precise over Wayne Rooney's career, England have played 11.9 games a year.
Yeah, what's 0.9 of a game?
That's a good question.
But the reason for this is that, I presume, is that more international teams play football these days. I mean, there are currently 209 men's national football teams affiliated to FIFA, and then the Marshall Islands, which are the only independent UN-recognised country that doesn't have a national team at all. And this means that tournaments and qualifying campaigns for those tournaments are getting bigger.
And that's highlighted by the fact that 32 teams played to win just one of 4 qualifying spots for the European Championships in 1972, whereas 54 teams will try and win one of 24 berths to take part in Euro 2020.
So how many caps would the greats from the past have won if they played in an era where teams averaged nearly 12 games a year, like England during Wayne Rooney's career? Our projections show that Pelé and Maradona would both have comfortably reached 100 caps had they played in today's era, although Platini has fallen short.
But it's Eusebio who would have benefited most from playing in today's era. During his lengthy Portuguese career, the national side only played 72 times, and he played in 64 of those games, so most of them, and he scored 41 goals. But we project that if he played today, he'd have won 138 caps.
There is another reason why players receive more caps today, and that's because they're awarded them for substitute appearances as well as being in the starting 11. Substitutes weren't permitted in the World Cups until 1970. 2 substitutes were introduced in all international games in 1988, and this was up to 3 in 1995. Now, you may be wondering who the most capped player of all time is. Now, this is Egypt's Ahmed Hassan on 184, and the most capped active player is Spain's World Cup winning goalkeeper Iker Casillas on 160. At the age of 33, Casillas doesn't really have time on his side to break the record, though.
But Wes, one man who does is his compatriot Sergio Ramos. Now, Ramos became the youngest player to win 100 caps when he was 26. He's now 28 and he's got 123 caps to his name, and he does have plenty of years left to play.
Thanks, Ben. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any numbers you want investigating, please email us at moreorless@bbc.co.uk. You can also listen to other editions of More or Less, exploring subjects such as whether homicide is a leading cause of death for pregnant women, to how we calculate the distance to the sun. And you can find these programmes by going to our website, bbcworldservice.com/more or less.
Documentaries on the BBC World Service. This is the story of how a religious Canadian farm girl became the most glamorous female evangelist in 1920s and 30s America.
Divine healing is as old as the Bible itself, and the Word of God endureth forever.
The compelling life story of Amy Semple McPherson, Sister Amy, online at bbcworldservice.com.
Listening to the BBC World Service.
At 1850 GMT, you can hear the latest information about local, regional and international efforts to contain and combat Ebola. Stay with us. World Update is next.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
10 a.m. in London, 5 a.m. in Washington, 1 p.m. in Nairobi. This is Dan Damon at the BBC. Ferguson has seen its worst rioting yet after a grand jury decided not to prosecute a white policeman who shot dead a black teenager. The former New York police chief tells us militarization of police forces needs a rethink.
The whole notion of providing civil police agencies with military equipment has to be rethought.
The Pope addresses the European Union. Does Roman Catholicism have a future in Europe? The UN says depression is a worldwide epidemic. There's a global summit on a disease costing billions.
It's a terrible feeling. The trouble is we don't have a kind of equivalent of morphine for mental pain, and it is acute pain, depression.
Plus, there won't be any snow in Africa this Christmas time. Birds fly at the speed of sound. Why do songwriters so often get the facts wrong? First, the news.